Respected scholar, dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, during the time that we have together, we will be discussing some of the challenges that we have in passing on, in inculcating an Islamic identity in our families, in our children, and creating a legacy that can be true to our heritage and our value system as Muslims. I'd like to devote as much time as possible to a discussion, question, answer, which will be following my brief talk. And so I will divide my remarks in 3 stages. My talk will consist of 3 parts. The first is for us to not talk about creating an Islamic legacy for others, but to developing an Islamic identity for ourselves. It's very common in our society to think about change as something that is external, reform as something that is external to ourselves. And so when parents want to teach their children to respect their elders, obey their parents, often that is expressed as a reminder, a message, preaching. As some children complain, my mother forwards every Facebook post or hadith that she finds on social media about how you should honor your parents. And I already know that that is the case. That is often something that we naturally fall into without realizing it. We think that an unjust person is somebody who is unjust to others. Whereas in the Quranic logic, dhulm is first and foremost something that you do to yourself. And even the injustice that you do to somebody else is to be understood, not primarily in terms of your relationship to somebody external to yourself, but your relationship with your own nafs, your own soul. Because if you don't rectify that internal relationship, then you can never truly be an upright, upstanding, or just member of society in your external relationships. Either you will not be able to achieve justice, or you might be able to achieve it, but it won't have that same staying power, that same stability, as if you had rectified your relationship with your own nafs. Or it might even have staying power, but it isn't going to have that same spiritual potency and that benefit for your akhirah and for your eternal life. Because it's not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not in recognition of the reality of your creation. So the first stage is not about inculcating an Islamic identity in somebody else, in making my children a better Muslim. It is for us to commit to creating and strengthening that identity for ourselves. Another common experience that I have heard several members of the community and ulama speak about, it is that we have an interest in Sunday school on the part of parents who have school-age children. If their children are too young to benefit from Sunday school, they're not interested in contributing, in volunteering, in attending. If their children have now come into that age when they're not going to attend regularly, they're teenagers now and they have after-school activities or sports, or they're getting ready to take standardized tests for admissions to college, or they've now graduated from high school and moved out of home, the attendance and the interest of the parent in Sunday school also goes down. For those of us who have been through the different stages of parenthood, it doesn't become less important to be a good Muslim as your children get older. It becomes more important. To parent a 7-year-old is not as difficult as to effectively parent a 15-year-old or an 18-year-old, a person who is now an adult, with not just their personal autonomy, but also their legal independence and autonomy. And so your need of a connection to a community for spiritual reinforcement and for education should go up when your children start leaving the house more often, because the time you spend with them is less. The quantity and sometimes the quality of your interactions goes down. Therefore, what's riding on each interaction is greater than it was before. And if I think that, well, what do I have to do with that environment? Because that's for children. That means that you're not thinking about participating in and benefiting from, or if they don't exist, finding and creating those resources that will give you the ability to be a better Muslim practitioner, and parent. That is the first challenge that many of us will face. The need for developing an Islamic identity is certainly important in the formative years of a person's life. But it does not decrease in importance through the later years of our life. And in many cases, there are certain specific challenges that we get that younger members of the community don't always get to preserve or to strengthen our own Islamic identity. And this is not the main focus of our discussion today. If there are questions on this aspect, they're welcome. You can note them down and ask them towards the end of the session, but that's not our main focus. But briefly, just to speak of a few of the issues and the challenges in this regard. When you enter an academic environment, you enter a professional environment, then you are entering into an arena that is governed by a logic not defined by spiritual values, not defined by Islamic values. There is a logic to the marketplace. There is a logic to the professional world. There is a logic to the academic world. I'm speaking about not some romanticized or idealized version of these different arenas in which we operate, but the real experienced reality that we interact with at different stages in our life. They introduce certain challenges to us. And that's why it's very common for people to have either an explicit crisis of faith when they go from the very comforting embrace of Sunday school, where every week they are reminded of that message that whatever humans might discover in science or in any field of human endeavor, the Quran said it 1400 years ago, the Prophet said it 1400 years ago, therefore Islam is the most beautiful religion. And then they go to a different environment and they discover that there are many opinions about some of those simple articles of faith that we may have heard and we may have believed. And that can lead to a crisis of faith. It can lead to a rejection or a pulling away from entertaining questions and doubts. It can lead to a giving in to those objections and those doubts. And all of those reactions can lead to a gradual erosion of a person's faith. And I will simply very briefly say that the most important thing for us to remember is that Iman, faith, belief in Islam is not purely an intellectual question. Yes, it has a lot to do with our intellect. And a religion revealed by God should never be a religion, or can never be a religion, that contradicts your intellect. But it also is not meant to be something that is limited to what is understandable and comprehensible by my limited intellect, which is subject to growth and which is subject to error. When we tend to think of spiritual or moral or religious questions as purely intellectual or philosophical, then it's like we're removing one of those foundations that is meant to maintain our faith. Not that the intellect is not also a foundation, but it's not the only foundation or the only basis. And if we summarize our religious identity into an intellectual question about the history of Islam or certain aspects of Islam, then it's expected that it might lead to that kind of a crisis. When we enter the professional world, then our success, our advancement, and for many people, even their self-esteem and their self-respect is determined by material factors, whether explicitly in monetary remuneration or indirectly in terms of the influence and in terms of the recognition and in terms of the power that comes from professional advancement or professional success. And that environment and that logic is also not something that is going to strengthen my religious identity. Both of those kinds of pressures are pressures that we as adults face in a way that our children, especially at younger ages, don't face at all or don't face as much. And so this is what I mean when I say that before we can think about inculcating an Islamic identity in others, we have to make sure that we have an Islamic identity and that we are protecting and preserving and deepening our own Islamic identity. Or else we might be building a foundation on sand. Whatever we build, it's not going to be able to develop strength and stability. It's not going to be able to be preserved. So that is the first stage. How can we protect our identity? How can we preserve our identity? How can we strengthen our identity as adults? Not for the sake of our children, but for the sake of our own identity. We have to maintain a connection to Islamic institutions, to Islamic sources of identity, to Islamic sources of learning, and to those avenues that allow us to deepen our passion for Islam, which may be ziyarah, which may be conferences like this, which may be areas where we are able to strengthen our own dedication and devotion to Islam. That is the first stage. Related to that is a question of what is an Islamic identity? What is it that we want to pass on? In many cases, how we think of Islam is very much a factor of that which differentiates a Muslim from others. And so we think of Islam as that which is uniquely or distinguishingly Muslim. But that is not the most important part of Islam. There are certain things that are so essential to Islam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not passed that message on to us through the Prophet or through revelation, but He has given us that message in the very fabric of our existence, even deeper than our intellect, in our very being. And in some cases, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that there are certain good deeds and certain bad deeds that Allah will not delay the reward or punishment for. The reward or punishment is going to come in this world, not in the hereafter. Soon in this world, and not far in the future. Why? Because those religious teachings are that important to an Islamic identity. The most important example is actually the topic of our conference this year. Silatul Rahim and Qati'atul Rahim. Maintaining good ties with your family, cutting off ties with your family. According to a hadith, keeping good ties with your family is kind of that immediate thing that will give you thawab and reward and blessings in this world. You know, I'm not a physician, so if the examples are not precise, then pardon me. But if somebody is suffering from diabetes and sometimes they feel like their blood sugar is out of whack, then that is not the time to look at long-term changes to their exercise or to their sleep or to their diet. They might need an immediate source of glucose to keep them alert. Then there is also a time to look at perhaps a long-standing change in lifestyle or in treatment. Silatul Rahim and Qati'atul Rahim are said to be two of the things that give you that immediate boost. You need an immediate pick-me-up in your spiritual life. Then show an act of kindness to a close relative. And if I decide to be unkind to my family, then that's a sin. And Allah will ask me about it on the Day of Judgment. If I have not repented, He might punish me for it in the hereafter. But I will be punished in this world, because it is also something that is essential and so important to Islam that Allah will not wait until the hereafter to give me the response. But we tend to think that, well, everybody understands the importance of family. That's not an Islamic issue. That's a matter of culture. That is a matter of just being a normal human being. So we separate something from Islam because it's not exclusively Islamic. It's not identifiably a Muslim thing. And therefore, what have we done? We've taken what is perhaps 20% of Islam that is not fitrah, that is not easy and obvious for us to appreciate, that comes only from revelation, and we have labeled that as Islam. And that's what we want to preserve. And what is the harm of that? Well, the harm of that is that if you are defining yourself by what differentiates yourself from others, then you are ignoring a big part of what actually qualifies as your religious identity. And therefore, that which differentiates you does not become the decoration on a firm building, but it becomes the building itself. And therefore, not only are you emphasizing something that shouldn't be front and center, but you are creating an entirely different reality than the reality Islam intended in the first place. Let me give you an example of that you sometimes find in Western discussions or debates about the reality of Islam or Shi'i Islam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And this is something that each and every one of us can relate to, even if we're not plugged into those academic discussions. I'll give both levels of example. There is a debate about whether Shi'ism is intrinsically kind of a mystical and a magical and a non-legal understanding of Islam. The primary role of the Imams is as the teachers of esoteric, batini knowledge, or whether Shi'i Islam is a legal and a theological school within the mainstream of Islam that also has some teachings which are of an esoteric nature, that are not of a purely legal nature. All of us are perhaps exposed to some aspects of those different perspectives, even without realizing it. One of the reasons for that difference is that sometimes a researcher may see something in, say, a book of hadith, and they might say, I don't see any difference between this and Sunni law on an essential level. There might be some difference in details. And so this is not the heart of Shi'ism. And so they will discount or ignore that data. Well, if you do that, that is going to give you a very inaccurate image of what Shi'ism actually is. The non-academic example, which is related to that. There are many Shia who like to debate with non-Shi'i Muslims. And so they comb through Sunni hadith books, history books, to get those narrations that help support a Shi'i case, which is certainly a worthy scholarly pursuit, but it has a potential danger. Because if you have looked at every report about Ahlul Bayt in a non-Shi'i source, then your image of who Ahlul Bayt were and what their proper role in society was will be filtered by the sources that you are using. And that might not be the way that Ahlul Bayt defined their own role to their followers. The image that you get from collecting all of the ahadith of the fada'il the virtues of Ahlul Bayt from Sunni sources is a very beautiful picture. And as many debaters and scholars and researchers and authors have said, it is sufficient for a person to realize the preeminence of Ahlul Bayt and their worthiness of being followed. However, it is not the same as the image of Ahlul Bayt you get from reading Az-Ziyara al-Jami'ah, because that is comprehensive and that is the self-definition by Ahlul Bayt of their own role. There is overlap, but there is a difference. And the difference is because you cannot understand Islam and you cannot understand Shi'i Islam without looking at its own sources and understanding it on its own terms. So, in looking at what is an Islamic identity, the biggest challenge that most of us have to undergo is to realize that Islam is existence itself. And everything that is true in existence is incorporated within Islam in one fashion or another. Islam is not just that which is only understandable through revelation, that which defies the human ability to rationalize or analogize. When the Quran says that people depart from Islam, in Surah Al-Imran, أَفَغَيْرَ دِينَ اللَّهِ يَبْغُونَ, are they looking for a religion other than Deenullah, the religion of God? What does Allah say is the religion of God? What is Deenullah? It is Islam. But وَلَهُ أَسْلَمَ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ طَوْعًا وَكَرْهًا. For Allah has submitted, to Allah has submitted that which is in the heavens and that which is in the earth, either willingly or unwillingly. So that means that Islam is part of the fabric of creation. Islam is not just law. Islam is not just that which is revealed by God that you and I cannot understand through experience or through our intellect. Islam incorporates all of the levels of existence. And it includes that law that can only be understood through revelation. What does that mean for us? It means that we should be looking for an Islamic identity that is not just anchored in certain superficial and identifiable markers, but that is defined by an approach to existence. When something is that profound, when something is that deep, you're not going to write a Wikipedia article or read a Wikipedia article and fully understand it. But what are you going to do? You're going to have an approach to try to gradually broaden your horizon and deepen your understanding. In the words of our beloved Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, the Prophet said, "Inna hadha ad-din mateen, fa'awghilu fihi birifq." Islam is a solid, a profound, a vast religion. So don't think that you can just kind of spend a Sunday afternoon and become an expert in Islam. Or because you have taught Sunday school for a number of years, or you have read a number of books, or even if you are somebody who is specialized in Islamic studies, that now you can speak authoritatively about what Islam is or what Islam teaches. It is your ethical relationship of Islam that is essential to your identity, not your legal or even your theological understanding. I want to make sure that point is clear. Theology tells you what you should believe. Law tells you what you should practice. Both of them are important. But both of them depend on a certain morality. If you have the proper approach, that proper morality, then you might not be an expert in Islamic theology right now, but you will gradually increase in awareness and knowledge. You will better understand how you should practice. But if you are not the right kind of person, then that's not going to result. There's a hadith of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salatu was-salam. The Imam was asked, what makes a person a mushrik? What makes a person a polytheist? What takes a person outside of Islam? The Imam says, if you have a date pit, the pit of a date, and you call it a pebble, and then you say, this is my religion. In other words, something that is insignificant. Neither a date pit is something that is valuable. If you find it on the floor, you won't think twice about it. You'll pick it up and throw it in the trash. It doesn't have any kind of monetary value. You don't give it any importance. If I find, a gem on the floor, then that'll make my day. But if I find a date pit on the floor or a pebble on the floor, I'll throw it away and forget about it the next second. Something even minor and insignificant like that. But if you mislabel it deliberately, ثُمَّ تَدِينَ اللَّهَ بِهِ, then you say, this is my deen, this is my religion. That is what takes you outside of Islam. It's not the big questions, that I'm going to worship a second God, or I am going to reject God. That is a very extreme form. But simply that very minute question. Is it important to distinguish a date palm, a date pit from a pebble? No. What is the Imam getting at? There is a moral failing in a person who sees something, knows something, but then believes, affirms, says, and acts according to something else. Is that a failure of your eyes? Is that a failure of your intellect? Is that a failure of your practice? Or is that a failure of your heart and your soul and your morality? When the Imam answers the questions about what the essence of Islam is, the Imam is speaking about that ethical foundation of faith. Why? Because the totality of Islamic practice and the totality of Islamic theology is too vast for me to be able to fully encompass. I can only begin on that journey. That doesn't mean anything goes. There are minimum beliefs that we have an obligation to study and to affirm in order to be a Muslim. There are minimum practices that we are obligated to learn about and to do well. Even if you don't want to be an expert in Islamic law, that doesn't mean that you have an excuse not to learn how to pray properly, how to do your washing and preparation for prayer properly, how to fast properly. So there are those minimums. But the most important thing is to be that person that when you see a nawat, a date pit, you call it a date pit, you don't call it a hasat, a pebble, and vice versa. Because that's what determines whether you are a mushrik or a mu'min, according to the hadith of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So it's not to deny the importance of law or the importance of theology, but to affirm the preeminence of ethics. And that is why you can see that in the time of our fourth Imam, Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salatu wassalam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. In a time when people had a great deal of confusion about some of the intricacies of Islamic theology and the proper practice of Islamic law, the Imam's focus was on establishing the ethics of Islam. Not just Sahifa Sajjadiyah, but the totality of the teachings of Imam Zainul Abidin, which include the du'as of Sahifa Sajjadiyah and other du'as and other spiritual teachings, in the form of du'a and munajat, and also many of the ahadith of the Imam. It's not because the Imam was not able to teach fiqh. It's not because the Imam was not able to teach theology. Because the Imams were not just passively responding to the circumstances of society, but they were agents in asserting those teachings that were most important to laying the foundation of an Islamic identity. And so if we look at the teachings of our Imam as a single continued teaching, then which was emphasized first? The ethical foundation, upon which our fifth Imam and our sixth Imam built a very intricate and a very detailed and a very beautiful edifice that included ethics and included theology and included law. So the second stage, I hope, is clear. Once again, for those who may have joined us, in inculcating an Islamic identity, the first challenge is to develop an Islamic identity, to make sure that we are Muslims, and that is important to us, for us to strengthen it and develop it. The second stage is for us to understand what it means to be a Muslim, and not to think that an Islamic identity, for many parents, their concerns are, is my daughter wearing hijab and dressing appropriately? Is my son praying or my daughter praying? Are they maintaining those manifestations of a Muslim identity? That is important. As we said, that is essential to Islam. But that is 20% of Islam. That remaining 80%, that foundation of the edifice, if that is weak, you can paint and you can decorate and you can adorn all you want, but eventually it will become shaky. Not that this is not important, and don't worry about whether your children are practicing, but your primary concern and your primary focus for yourself and for them should be on a certain framework, a certain approach to life. So Islam is mateen. Islam is profound. Islam is something which incorporates all of existence. And that is why lahu aslama man fis samawati wal ard taw'an wa karhan. Because if Islam were not comprehensive, then everything in heaven and earth would not be a Muslim. Everything is a Muslim because Islam encompasses the wisdom behind all of existence, all of creation. Not just the religion that you and I practice. And that brings us to the third and the final stage. What are some of the challenges that we face in creating an Islamic identity in our children, passing on that Islamic identity? And here I'm just going to point to a few of the challenges that we face, inshallah, and this will hopefully transition us to questions and a discussion that will follow. The first point for us to remember is that our identity is something that we are agents in creating. These are not things that are handed to us or given to us or beyond our control. It is an affirmation. People identify very strongly with their race. Some people. That doesn't mean that this is natural. In fact, many of us are aware of how race is a social construct that doesn't have any kind of genetic or any kind of biological basis. But for those people who identify very strongly, that reality, even though it doesn't have any Islamic weight or any moral weight or any biological weight, seems very real. We create our identities for better or for worse. And I say that because in our society, people are often insufficiently respectful of this point. I want to be careful how I word it because I don't want to say something controversial, but it's an essential point. When it comes to gender, when it comes to our circles with which we identify and we sympathize, in many cases, the message that we receive from society is one that does not recognize that our identity is one that we create and we have control over. And the most important factor that determines our identity should be morality and not biology or history or culture or anything that was given to us. When Allah says that إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى, we created you from a man and a woman. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا, and we made you into nations and tribes that you may recognize one another. That is not a negation of the importance of ethnicity and culture and those distinguishing features that allow us to appreciate the diversity that Allah has created. There is an affirmation of that. But when that is followed up with إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ, the point of that is that you give value not to those superficial circumstances that were given to you and over which you had no control. That doesn't mean it's not important, but it means it's not foundational to how you value your life and how you create your loyalties and your identity. So that is a very important message for us to pass on to our children. That in an age-appropriate way, and because we're speaking not to one specific age group of preschool children or pre-adolescents or adolescents, I'll have to leave that to the individual circumstances, how to communicate that in an age-appropriate way. But we determine how we want to identify. So, I may be a man or a woman. I may be of a certain socioeconomic class or a certain level of education. I might come from a certain ethnicity, a certain background, but I determine whether I view myself primarily through my identification with my gender, for example, or with my ethnicity, or with my nationality, or with my linguistic group, or with some other orientation or inclination that I may have. None of that is automatic. It is a decision that I make. And so I have to create an environment that allows me to affirm meaningful and principled sources of identity. This is why you cannot have a virtual masjid. This is why you should not attend virtual services if you have any possible way of being present for real and in person. Because you create your identity by whom you associate with, and where you go, and what you say, and what you do, and what thoughts you entertain within your mind. So your identity is something that you are responsible for and that you have agency over. It's not something that you just discover. It's not something that you are passively given. That is the first point. The second point is that we should not focus upon getting a certain result from our children, but we should focus upon ensuring that they see Islam as a source of inspiration and strength and meaning in life. This means that we have to give our children agency from a young age. As I mentioned yesterday in my talk, that famous hadith which says that the first 7 years of their life children are a monarch, what that really means, as I understand it, is that you are giving your children agency. Not that you're living according to their terms, or you're letting them live according to their terms. No, they still have to eat their vegetables, but you're not going to punish them. You're going to bribe them, and you're going to convince them. You're teaching them when they're weak and they're small, and they know that they're not as strong as you, and they don't know as much as you do. You're teaching them that they do have agency, they do have some level of influence and control over the most powerful people they know, their parents. That is one of the messages, if not the primary message of that hadith. And then in Islam, that ever controversial teaching we have that you become baligh, you become an adult, far before you are capable of living independently. Why? Because Islam wants us to realize that before you can be handed a gun, before you can be handed a driving license, I'm not saying that you should give your kids guns, I'm saying before you are legally old enough to own a firearm, before you are legally old enough to drive a car, before you are legally old enough to make your own decisions about your material assets, you have moral agency. You are a moral being, and you should feel responsible for doing good. You should be responsible for your salat, for your acts of worship, for your dress, for your diet. That is meant to train children to take responsibility when they are still adolescents, before their mind and their emotions and their bodies are fully developed. So as they develop physically, intellectually, and emotionally as spiritual and as moral beings, not just as citizens of a political state, or consumers in a market, but as moral beings in a universe that is governed by moral laws. Why do we become adults in Islam, baligh, mature at such a young age? Because Islam wants to make sure that we feel that responsibility and that agency. But in many cases, perhaps in many of our families, we don't really understand the value of that teaching. And so we kind of backtrack. We baby our children. Even our teenage children, sometimes, it is the mother or the father that is keeping track of whether they've said their prayers and whether they've done their other personal responsibilities. We are still picking up after them, literally and figuratively. And that is not what Islam wanted. The goal is to make your 13-year-old, 14-year-old child feel responsible for waking up for Fajr. That might mean that you remind them, but ask them if they are at that age, for example, do you have an alarm? Or do you need me to wake you up? So that the onus is on them. Because you don't want to send your college freshman to school and then you have to call them and say, it's Fajr time, make sure you wake up because I'm not sure if you're going to make your class. I'm not sure if you're going to make your prayer. And that's not just a Muslim issue. Even in society, there are many people who leave home for college and for the first time, they have to think like an adult and take personal responsibility. It's a general problem, but it's also there in our Islamic community. The final point that I will make, and this applies especially from a younger age, give children a pride in what Islam represents in its entirety. Islam certainly is teachings about law, about what to practice and what to believe. But that message of Islam inspired a whole civilization. And if our children feel a connection and a pride and an identification with the different expressions of Islamic civilization, then they will have several different links connecting them to their Islamic identity. If you have inculcated a pride in the literature of classical Islamic civilizations, then that is often a distilled form of Quran and Hadith. It doesn't replace reading the Quran and reading primary sources of dua and religious guidance. But in many ways, it kind of orients you in a constructive manner. And people have different personalities, they have different interests, they have different challenges that they face, ups and downs in their life. If all I have taught my children is that religion is Quran and the commemoration of the birth and death of Ahlul Bayt and certain ritual practices and certain legal practices, then I have given them one connection, one link, but not the others. And for some children, because of their life circumstances, because of their personality, that may not be enough to maintain and strengthen an Islamic identity. So when you plan your schedule, when you plan your travels, even when you're decorating your own home, when you're determining how to spend your leisure time, remember that one of your goals as an Islamic family and as a Muslim parent is to give your children a familiarity and a connection to the totality of Islamic civilization. And if you have Muslim family members or close friends, a connection to those family members and those close family friends, because that will give you a broader and a richer reservoir of strength to maintain the Islamic identity. So those are some of the ways that we can strengthen and we can deepen the identification with Islam among our future generations. Once again, in the first instance, think of our own identity and strengthen it. In the second instance, remember that Islam is comprehensive and not just limited to those things that non-Muslims and even many Muslims think of as Islam or think of as Sharia. And number 3, you want to train children to claim their own identity, but not to create it on their own terms, but to value that struggle in life of creating an identity on terms that are in accordance with the teachings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. We have agency, but we don't have the authority to live life according to our own terms. We are empowered and we have agency in order to try to honor the potential and the promise that Allah has created within us. And if we keep those values, then inshallah we will be able to pass on the most important of legacies, which is a connection and a commitment to Islam and to the path of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum. So you were talking about like being able to, the way I understood it, that if you are raised or you raise a child and help them create their identity in comparison to others, then you're minimizing their potential of reaching their ethical potential. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes. What I'm trying to say is that in many cases, our conception of what an Islamic identity entails is in contrast to others. Yes. So, for example, you're in a losing battle and it's an unstable kind of identity, right? Just like a meaningful spiritual life is not possible by trying to compete with somebody else. Similarly, a meaningful religious identity is not possible if you're thinking about it in terms of what differentiates Muslims from non-Muslims, what differentiates Shia Muslims from non-Shia Muslims, right? Because for one thing, that's a lot of pressure on certain teachings that were never meant to be the main focus of our emotional energy, right? If we're thinking entirely about those differences. So, you know, a lot of people in our community, they reach a breaking point because of something that is important, but it's still not the essence of what is a Muslim. And because they reach a breaking point on that issue that's a little bit on the periphery or very much on the periphery, sometimes it's not even something wajib. Sometimes the parent compelled the children to do something that is not wajib, and then the child breaks because of that, and then decides that they don't really want their Islamic identity at all. That is a severe tragedy. Even if it's wajib, right? Then if that is going to cause a potential breach in something that is more essential to Islam, then that's not, you know, a bridge worth dying on. It's not the way to fight that battle. So to be able to choose those battles effectively, and it's not necessarily a battle, it's not necessarily the best analogy, but to be able to provide that support and that guidance effectively for our children. It's important for us to understand Islam on its own terms, to understand the teachings of Ahlul Bayt on their own terms, not contentiously. So that means that those things that are practices, they are not going to be front and center. A lot of times in our communities, for example, people take pride that their children at a very young age have memorized, so many surahs, or have read so much of the Quran, or have memorized certain du'as. And, we have a 5-year-old doing the adhan. No, adhan, I'm just giving an example, right? If your masjid has 5-year-olds do the adhan, great, more power to you. I'm not trying to undermine that. But the adhan is something that is the symbol of our faith. The most knowledgeable, the most pious person, the person with the best voice, an adult, can carry that symbol. A 5-year-old can learn and maybe do it at home and gain confidence, because we're not trying to say, have my child finish the Quran, reciting the Quran by a young age, memorize the 30th juz by a young age. Right? Those are manifestations. Those are external manifestations. The goal is for a child to understand the Quran as a source of solace and support and guidance and inspiration and blessing in its recitation, in its presence. Right? So if I am traveling somewhere and I forget to bring a Quran, or if I change phones and I don't have a Quran app installed, then I should feel like I'm missing something. Right? That is important. So to do that, you have to focus your attention somewhere else. Don't contrast and don't compete. And certainly none of that, well, my child knows more than your child, so we're better off. Right? Which is often how we tend to self regulate our our Islamic training and upbringing. It's often based on external factors. It's based on contrasting with others. It's based on competing with people within our own community. All of those are the wrong way to do things.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum
I had a question about what a good litmus test is for us to be able to identify whether the identity that we've built is one of the tongue or actually one in application. So how do we know that the identity that we would like to have, or that maybe we've developed as our personal brand, is actually the one that we're living and breathing? What's a good litmus test for that?
That's a very good question. One of the reasons why we have such an emphasis on reminding ourselves of the lives of Ahlul Bayt is because that kind of an evaluation cannot be done only consciously and deliberately. It has to be done sometimes indirectly and implicitly. So when you want to connect to Ahlul Bayt, your primary goal is not to learn new facts or information or even a new analysis or a new perspective about Ahlul Bayt. Right? Your primary goal is to deepen your connection and your passion for their mission, for their message. Partially by learning new things, partially by getting a new analysis, but a large part of it, and I would say the greater part of it, is by increasing your passion and your identification with that which you already know. It's often after you've heard something the second time or the third time that you can really start to deepen your connection with it. And that will indirectly change the way you interpret events that happen in your own life. Something that would have seemed like a setback now seems like something that might be simply a test by Allah, or an opportunity for us to reconsider what's important, maybe a setback at work, or a personal setback, right? Rather than think of that as a disappointment, if we're living, breathing, thinking, speaking the framework of Ahlul Bayt, then we will begin to appreciate those things according to a different logic. So once again, I don't want to discount the intellectual part, the analytical part, the deliberate part. But I think most of us, we have some attention to that. That's why I'm emphasizing something else. Another thing that I would say in our society is we tend to over-intellectualize things, right? So, in my experience, if people hear a lecture about Ahlul Bayt where they didn't learn anything new, but it's a very powerful statement of essential principles of life according to the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, right? Versus a lecture where they learned a lot of new things, but it's kind of intriguing, but not fully digested. They'll value and they'll gravitate towards the second more than the first, right? Because we are kind of primed to like something innovative and new. We think it's more important. But if I haven't digested it, and I'm not therefore able to live it, then it's of somewhat limited utility for me. So I think we need to also step back from that tendency to look for only intellectually edifying, meaning something that's interesting and intriguing, and give greater emphasis to that which is strengthening and reinforcing our identity. Those two things, I think, can help us better evaluate whether the way that I think about my life is something that I'm creating or is something that is actually Islamic. It's a gradual process, but I think this is more effective than trying to think your way to an Islamic identity. Do that, but maybe as a secondary piece of the puzzle. If the questions are not being sufficiently addressed, or if you still have ambiguity, please let me know.
Thank you for your great lecture. First of all, this is my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong. But as far as I understood, Quran brings in quite a few instances these two words together as means of testing human beings, your children and your belongings. So I was wondering, how do you relate these kind of tests from Allah to the first point that you made? Try to focus on yourself before trying to improve others, which includes your children as well.
Yeah, one of the hadith, thank you for that question. One of the hadith I wanted to mention, I forgot to mention it in my talk, was hadith of the Prophet, Rahimallahu walidain a'ana waladahuma ala birrihima. May Allah have mercy on parents who make it easy for their children to do kindness to them. So sometimes we think that our children should be good to us, but we don't realize that we have a big part to play in making it easy for them to be good to us or not. If we are good parents and if we are good people, then it's still the choice the children make. And they have to be good to their parents, whether their parents are making it easy or making it difficult. But if you make it easy, you're going to have much better results. So what we're referring to is we're saying that you want to live Islam as fully and as properly as you can, so that you're able to make it easy to for others to honor their relationship with you and to value and to then continue that identity. So the point of that is not to say that just focus on yourself and your children or your families are not important or your community is not important. The point of that is to recognize that what you do for your family, what you do for your children, is because of a proper understanding of your relationship to Allah. your own obligation to Allah. In other words, what I'm doing for my children is not for my children. It's because they are a trust given to me by Allah. And my worship for Allah means that I don't spend my whole time in salat. I play with my children. I spend time with my children. I value that relationship with my parents. That is part of my ibadah. So to focus on living Islam fully and properly means that I will be best positioned in all of my relationships to honor that relationship. So you can never have too much religion. You know how sometimes people say that, oh, this person has too much religion. They're no fun. If they're no fun, they don't have enough religion. It's actually why the second caliph said Imam Ali is not qualified to be a caliph. One of the things, أنت رجل فيك دعابة. You're too fun to be around. So, paraphrasing a little bit. But there's no such thing as too much God or too much religion in your life, because the more God and the more religion you have in your life, the more you will value your other obligations and your relationships, because that is what God is telling you to do. So there's no contradiction. Does that answer the question?
Sayyid, I was reminded of a couple of hadith throughout your discussion. When you were talking about the ethical level of your relationship with Islam and your logical and theological, I was wondering, what about the emotional aspect and how does that fit into this framework? It reminded me of that hadith, Hal ad-dinu illa al-hub, is religion anything other than love? And I was wondering how this fits into this overall framework. And then also on manifestation, I was reminded of that hadith where the 5 signs of the mu'min, they're all manifestations. Saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim loudly in your prayers, wearing the ring on the right hand, reciting Ziyarat al-Arba'in. So if you could comment on the significance of manifestations.
Both very good questions. Emotions really are the most immediate response of our ethical makeup. Right? So I can control what I say. I can control what I do. And I have some control over what I believe. But emotions, I do have control. Right? If I associate with people who are very competitive, even if by nature I'm not a very competitive person, I will gradually adopt certain. I will gradually adapt to that environment, and my emotional makeup might change. I might become desensitized or sensitized to certain things. So I do have control over my emotions, but much less directly. So your ethical framework is most intimately tied to your emotions before your verbal and your external actions. So when we speak of the importance of that ethical foundation to our identity, the first place that's going to show up is in your emotions. Right? So for example, right now, if you tell me, let's say that both of us were competing for a single scholarship, and if you tell me that, the Muslim group has a scholarship and you got it, and I might say congratulations, but the first thing that comes into my mind is, you didn't deserve it. I deserved it. Right? My words are fine, and I might even be kind, and my actions might be fine. But that emotional response, that will come from the ethical foundation. And there's a different logic to how we have to gradually refine our emotional responses, because we don't directly control them, but we do have agency there. Our environment, how we live the rest of our life will show up in this place. Our level of humility. Numerous ahadith say that if you're looking for makarimul akhlaq, then the most important thing is to ask Allah to give them to you. Why? Because I can't force myself to be a person with good akhlaq. I can fake it, But for it to be in my heart, that is a gift that comes from Allah, where He strikes me with sickness just where I need it to become humble, where He prevents me from waking up for Fajr just where I need it so I don't become arrogant, where He wakes me up for Salatul Layl just where I need it to get that push. That comes from Allah. And that infinite number of circumstances that are beyond my control that build me into an ethical person, that's a gift from Allah. So faking the expression doesn't make you an ethical person, but it can help. So when Imam Al-Hasan Al-Askari alayhi salatu wasalam says that ala'imul mu'mini khams, that's ala'im, not arkanul iman. Right? It's not the basis or the foundation, it is the expression. And the expression is important. The signs are important. That is why we are told that, for example, if you're not feeling sad when you hear about Imam Hasan, fake it. Why fake it? Because it gives you a sense of what you should be feeling. And gradually, that creates a feeling within you as well. It facilitates it, right? So, if I'm dressed and acting in a very non-grieving manner, that's not going to facilitate a feeling of grief coming within me. Faking that expression of grief can help me appreciate the importance of it and develop it. But that's not what's going to really give it to me. That faking the outcome that I think is right, that's not what's going to make me have a good emotional response or become an akhlaqi person, become mutakhalliq. How is that going to happen? That is going to come from Allah training my not even training, but creating the circumstances of my life to reinforce moral values. That comes when I ask Allah for it, and when I live my life in a way that shows that I want spiritual advancement. Allahumma